English webinar course, shaping the way we teach English. Webinar Wednesday.
Hello and welcome to Shaping the Way We Teach English Webinar Course 16, brought to you by the American English team. My name is Jennifer Hodgson, also known as Moderator Jenny, part of the American English team based in Washington, D.C. So welcome to our large community of teachers from all around the world. We see teachers from so many different countries joining us. This webinar course, Course 16, is specifically about English Teaching Forum. So all the presenters in this series are also English Teaching Forum authors. How many of you have read English Teaching Forum? Raise your hand. So it's a quarterly journal. It's written by teachers for teachers. It's been around for 53 years. But this year, Forum has a new look. So we have a new cover, but we also have lots of new content. One new part of English Teaching Forum is the Reader's Guide. And this is where you can find information about the article and have a discussion with your colleagues reading the same article together. You can find this in the news section of Forum on americanenglish.state.gov. So as you can see, the Course 16 schedule is here. We have 3 more webinars after today. And today's topic is the gradual release of responsibility with Sandra Clark. So during these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter. The way for you to participate is using the chat box, as you are already doing. And this is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. You will see myself, Moderator Jenny, as well as Moderator Heather, Moderator Katie, and Moderator Tony in the chat box to help you. But we also rely on you to help each other. We won't be able to answer all of your questions during the live session because there's hundreds of teachers participating from around the world, but we will show you the place where you can ask questions after the webinar. Your presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls, and these are just multiple choice questions that will appear on your screen. We know that sometimes you may have technical difficulties such as sound issues. We cannot fix individual issues, but we will let you know if there is a global problem. But if you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is with the caption pod that you see at the bottom of the screen. So webinar courses are in sets of 6, and as you know, they take place every other Wednesday. If you would like to earn an e-certificate, you need to attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars of the course. These are issued by your regional English language officer or U.S. Embassy after the webinar series is over. To ensure you are eligible to receive your certificate, we ask that you submit your attendance only at the very end of the webinar. At that time, we'll provide you with a link in which you need to click on the link and submit information such as your name, your country, and if you are watching this webinar with a group, then you'll also need to include the number of participants. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a place for you to ask questions after the webinar is over. This is our shapingenglish.ning.com site. Most of you are probably already familiar, but if not, you can still join this website. This is where you'll find all of the recordings of previous webinars, readings and resources, PowerPoints, lots of material, but this is also where you can ask your presenter questions after the webinar is over. So we're very excited for today's topic, the gradual release of responsibility. And our presenter will discuss how the gradual release of responsibility model will improve teaching abilities in any setting and illustrate them with practical applications for both teachers and teacher trainers. The 4 stages that will be discussed today are the focused lesson, guided instruction, collaborative learning, and independent practice. Our presenter is Sandra Clark. Sandra is passionate about teaching language and especially passionate about making connections with English learners, whether they are students or teachers. Currently, she teaches academic English in the American English Institute at the University of Oregon and has a long history of professional development, being a teacher trainer in the U.S. public school system, a senior English language fellow in Brazil, and an instructor of many online teacher training courses. She began her career as a 2-way Spanish-English immersion teacher in Oregon and California in the United States.
Thank you, Moderator Jenny, for the nice introduction. And welcome to everyone to this webinar. It's a joy to be here, connected to people from all over the world. It's my great pleasure to be here today, and not only because I so enjoy working with English teachers, but also because the gradual release of responsibility, is my favorite teaching awareness. So it is my hope that it has as deep an effect on your instruction as it has had on mine. So before we continue, let's talk a little bit about the lobby polls. So in terms of, have you heard of the gradual release of responsibility? It looks like about 85% of you have not heard of the gradual release of responsibility, more or less. And then if you look at time that you've spent on your lessons, then most of you spend, about 82% spend under about 10 minutes on your focused lesson, and then about 15% more or less spend about 10 to 20 minutes. And so I'm getting feedback that that it's hard to hear me. Let me just take a moment to increase my sound and see if that is going to help us at all. Just give me just a second. All right, so I've increased it as much as possible on my end. Hopefully it is better to hear now. So, all right, so let's start by talking about this situation. So, I often begin this talk with the idea of the blank stare. So, a blank stare. So that is an expression in English that refers to what your face looks like when you are suddenly confused. So pretend that you're going along just fine, and then all of a sudden you're faced with something that you did not expect. So for example, and this is a true story, I was walking on a path one day, and when I began my walk, the weather was great. I thought I knew where I was going. I was walking deep in thought, and then I looked up and I saw what you see in this picture. So the weather had changed, it had gotten foggy, and I had lost my way. So I had never seen this tree before. So in this moment, I stopped short in my tracks. My face grew long, and my eyes opened wide. So it took me a moment to understand what my eyes were seeing, and that moment is the blank stare. So what does that have to do with teaching? So how about this? You teach a great lesson, and then your students give you that look, the blank stare look. And even worse, you just taught a really good lesson, and so you're confused. If you taught a really good lesson, what just happened? Why are the students looking at you like that? You may even stare back at them for just a moment. Well, it's time for true confessions and a quick check-in. So here's my question, and while you do that, I will check my sound. I think the sound is a little bit tough for us today. So those of you who can hear me, has this ever happened to you raise your hand if that's true. And so I'm going to check my sound again one more time. And so my sound on my computer is turned all the way up, and my sound in this webinar is turned all the way up as well. So just letting the folks who are organizing this, let them know that we are working on the sound. Okay. So it looks like for most of you that you have had this experience, and I will do my best to speak really loudly. So when this happens, it is time for the gradual release of responsibility. So the gradual release of responsibility is an awareness that can prevent the blank stare from happening in the first place, and it can help you reflect about your lesson if it does happen. So let's go on to what this webinar will be about today. So I hope today to demonstrate how an awareness of the gradual release of responsibility can, 1, strengthen your teaching abilities, lead to authentic student-centered classrooms, number 2, and number 3, provide a tool for self-reflection. And so we will be going over these stages, this agenda. We are going to define and describe the 4 stages. We're going to present 4 common teaching scenarios. We're going to deepen knowledge and show power strategies. We're going to discuss teacher training. We're going to give some refinements and then present some outcomes. So let's begin. Okay, so I'm getting a message that the sound is still a problem. So before we start this first section, let's take a moment and check the sound. And I will turn it back over to...
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for your patience today. We're trying to work on the volume for just a moment. Please raise your hand if you can hear me. We're going to go ahead and put Sandra back on. Thank you. I see lots of people are raising their hand. Thank you so much. You can actually click on the same icon to lower your hand. And now we're going to go back to Sandra, and we would love to continue to have your feedback in the chat box. We're going to have her go on just one more time, and then if you can just let us know by raising your hand if you can hear Sandra when she is on, and also let us know how the sound is in the chat box as you have been doing. Thanks so much.
Okay, so let me do a quick sound check. Are you able to hear me? And I'm going to do just one more sound check on my end. Aha, so this might do it. How are you doing now with this? Okay, I think we figured out the problem, and we are ready to move on. I thank everyone for your patience and for your feedback, and I'm happy that we are able to move on. And it was just fine timing, because let's go ahead and start to define and describe this idea of the gradual release of responsibility. So a few weeks ago, Katie Bain gave a shaping webinar called Lesson Planning 101, called Mapping Activities for a Clear Path to Learning. She presented one of the 4 ways of ordering a lesson as a gradual release of responsibility. So we're going to build on that awareness today. So let me give you this quote that says from Pearson and Gallagher that instructors purposefully yet gradually release responsibility for learning from teacher to student in 4 distinct steps. And so that's it in a nutshell. And this quote came out in the first time that we saw this idea in print by Pearson and Gallagher in 1983. And so it's kind of stayed around until about 2008 when Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry wrote an article called Releasing Responsibility. I saw it then. And that I would say that since then, in many ways, in many different areas with every age student from 3 years old to graduate studies. It has changed my teaching. So before we go on, let me say that I know that teaching is tough. So we have so much to do, so many students, so much content, testing, time is always an issue, resources, lots of responsibility. And so I want to put your mind at ease and say that you do not need to throw out everything you know to have this awareness. The gradual release of responsibility is an awareness and not a program. It's just an idea, a way of thinking about teaching, and it's a way to deepen your awareness about your teaching. So if you look at this blue arrow, you can see that it goes from student dependence to student independence. So we always start out with students not really knowing what the content is, but we want them to always, at the end, be independent learners. So we want them to be able to use the skill or the content that you are teaching. And so today we're going to talk about reaching student independence through 4 stages: the focus lesson, guided instruction, collaborative learning, and independent practice. And sometimes we call it the I do it, the we do it together, the you do it together, and the you do it alone stages. Now, the role for the teacher and the student is different in each stage, and they go from the teacher having 100% responsibility in the focus lesson to the student having 100% responsibility in independent tasks. But taking that responsibility and gradually and with intent and purpose, giving it from the teacher to your students. So in the focus lesson, the teacher provides direct instruction, the teacher demonstrates and models. And the students at that point are actively listening. They're not participating quite yet. They're not ready for questions because it's brand new information. The next stage is guided instruction, which is questioning, prompting, and modeling from the teacher. And then the student has become more active contribution, and then they ask and respond to questions. And then in collaborative learning, the teacher's job is to hover. So they clarify, they guide. Hovering means just like walking around the edges of groups and listening to them, kind of listening to what's happening as they're working on their content. And the student's job is to be much more responsible for the learning, active learning in peer or paired group or group work. And then finally, 100% burden on the students with independent tasks. The teacher has stepped way back, and now it's time for them to assess. So we're going to look at these 4 stages in 4 common teaching scenarios. And I know that you're going to recognize these scenarios. So we're going to use this idea of gerund versus infinitive as the content that I'm going to use when I talk about these 4 teaching scenarios. So let me take a moment to explain. This is a concept in English language learning that is confusing to students. And that's because the verb takes different forms, but it has the same grammatical function in a sentence. So a gerund is a verb that's in the ing form. An infinitive is a verb that's in the to form. And we're going to use it in the terms of an object in the sentence. So it's going to be subject, verb, object. So these examples, they enjoy dancing. The verb enjoy takes a gerund. They hope to dance every day. The verb hope takes an infinitive. They prefer to dance at clubs, or they prefer dancing. Some verbs take both. And so unfortunately, English is very quirky, and there aren't very strong rules about when you use gerund and when you use infinitive. So it's difficult to come up with a strategy for helping your students learn the rule. English is just too quirky for a rule. So we're going to use it in a little bit different way. So my lesson objective is to identify and use important verbs with the correct form, infinitive or gerund. So that's my goal. I want my students to be able to use the correct verb form. And the strategy that I want them to use is to use the chart that's in our text as a reference. So I'm going to be teaching both of those things, the lesson objective, plus I want to make sure that my students are going to use this strategy to help them. So let's look at teaching scenario number 1. In teaching scenario number 1, the teacher delivers a stellar lesson on infinitives and gerunds. That's great. So stellar means a really good lesson. So because the gradual release of responsibility is an awareness and not a program, that stellar lesson, that great lesson, can be whatever lesson you are comfortable giving, whatever style is yours to give, you're comfortable with, or your system wants you to use, that's fine. We're not going to tell you this is the right way or that's the wrong way. It's just the awareness that when you're giving this lesson, you have 100% of the responsibility. Because this is a focus lesson, right? You're giving the lesson, the focus lesson. And that's a great teaching scenario. Let's look at lesson scenario number 2. So in this scenario, the teacher delivers a stellar lesson on gerunds and infinitives. So it's the same stellar lesson. Great. But this time we're going to have the students complete fill-in-the-blank exercises in the workbook. So we're going to think that that first lesson, of course, is the focus lesson. And now with students working on their own, that would be independent learning. So in this lesson scenario, we went from focus lesson to independent learning. 100% teacher responsibility to 100% student responsibility. And that's a common lesson. I think we've all taught lessons like that. Let's see if we can't deepen it with this lesson scenario. Once again, a very common teaching scenario. So in this one, the teacher delivers his stellar lesson, his great lesson, and then he monitors his classroom as the students work in pairs using sentence starters. So in that blue cloud, I have a few examples of sentence starters. I am considering, did he pretend, etc. So you're using those for students to practice deciding if those verbs take a gerund or infinitive as the object. And then the students complete those exercises in the workbook. So this you can see, same focus lesson. And then this middle activity is collaborative learning, because the students are working and the teacher's hovering, right? And then the students complete the exercises in the workbook. That would be our independent learning. Now, this lesson scenario is very common and very good. In fact, our researchers, Fisher and Frey, would say that lesson scenario number 3 is good. It's good, but they would say that it's not good enough. So it's not good. All right, do we have sound now? I'm getting the feedback that we lost the sound. Okay. All right, sound is back. Yay, we are definitely having sound issues today. So I'm just going to go back to this quote. All right. So lesson scenario is good. Lesson scenario 3 is good, but it's not good enough to result in deep thinking, critical or creative thinking, or the ability to mobilize strategies as needed. So even if you missed a little bit of this, I think you're going to be okay because we're going to come back to this. So let's look at lesson scenario number 4. And this is actually a lesson that I have been teaching this week in my own class. We are doing gerunds versus infinitives as the object. Remember that my goal is that they identify and use the right form of the verb, and they use the strategy. So having your students know the strategy is really important. So watch this lesson and see how the gradual release of responsibility applies. All right? So here I'm going to give that same in-class stellar lesson as my focus lesson. You'll notice that that lesson has not changed the whole time. But instead of going to workbook already, I'm going to do a We Do It Together questionnaire. And so in this questionnaire, everybody in the class is getting the same handout that you see right here. Everybody has the first 2 questions already listed and 2 questions that are not finished. So I will ask my students, do you enjoy taking risks? And then I will model how the verb enjoy takes the gerund, and I will show that I'm using my book and the charts in my book to make sure. So that I'm really wanting my students to use that strategy of checking the chart in their book. They don't really want to. It's a little bit of an extra step, but I really want them to know this strategy. And then I'm going to model it again with, do you need to take more risks to have a more exciting life? Need takes infinitive, and we're going to model that as well. Then together we're going to create 2 new sentences that are on topic. So my class right now is studying taking risks and facing challenges. So I'm going to make sure that my questions are about that. And maybe together we will make up questions like, do you dislike the feeling of being afraid? Or do you try something new at least once a month? So we will work on this together. Now I'm also going to model how to use this questionnaire. So once we have the questions, I'm going to go to the student and I'm going to say to a volunteer student, do you enjoy taking risks? And I'll model tallying, yes or no, depending on what that student says. I'll ask the next question, do you need to take more risks to have a more exciting life? I'll model all those and tally. And then I will also model having the student ask me back. So they might say, oh, Sandra, do you enjoy taking risks? And I will say, yes, I enjoy taking risks. Modeling that, I'm going to say the whole sentence in the answer, and that making sure the student knows how to tally. It's interesting that sometimes the tallying, the marking who says yes and who says no, can be somewhat tricky. And so that's our day. So that is doing guided instruction. We are doing that together. Now the next day, I'm going to do a collaborative learning phase, and I'm going to step out of it just a little bit. So in this phase of my lesson on gerunds and infinitives, I'm going to put the students in groups of 4. And every group of 4 has a different questionnaire. The first 2 questions, however, are the same in everyone's. That way I can still model if needed. So the first question, do you like being in the zone? The second, do you agree to try something risky at least once a year? And then each student will have a different number 3 and a different number 4. And they will work together in their group of 4 to create questions. Once I check the questions to make sure that they are using correct English, especially around gerund or infinitive, they're off to do the questionnaire once again. So they're using these verbs over and over again, and they're doing it in a gradual release of responsibility way. So let's look at the last step would be, of course, independence. So I would give my students an online homework. Right now we are using an online program, a grammatical program. It's really sweet and easy for my students. Maybe I'll give them a quiz, or maybe, not maybe, I actually expect them to now use correct gerunds and infinitives in their writing. So they are now completely independent, and I will have gone through the 4 steps, which are, once again, the focus lesson, the I do it, the guided instruction stage, we do it together, the collaborative learning, you do it together, and the independent practice, the you do it alone stage. Okay, so we're going to deepen our knowledge about each of those stages. And remember that our goal is always student independence. It's student independence. We want our students to be individual learners. So before we start, let's take a poll with these 2 questions. So the first question, and you're thinking ahead, you're just guessing, so you're predicting which stage do you think can be the trickiest stage, the trickiest, like the hardest one for you to do as a teacher. So we had some quick answers on focus lesson. Yeah, that focus lesson can be kind of tricky. It's about equal between guided instruction, collaborative learning, and independent practice. It looks like now fewer people are thinking that the focus lesson is tricky, and it's still about equal, maybe heavily weighted on independent practice. So we're kind of all over the place with this idea of which stage can be the trickiest. Hold on to that thought, and then let's go to the second poll. So the second poll is, which is the stage in which questioning strategies are extremely important? So we're going to, once again, you're just guessing at this point. The answers will come up in just a little bit as we go through the next section. It's something to listen for. So where do we question? I see about 58% thinking guided instruction. The other, maybe 25%, a little bit less, thinking independent practice. A few people thinking focused lesson. A few people thinking collaborative learning. And then, of course, a few people thinking all. So it looks like guided instruction is where most people is landing right here. Excellent. So let's go back to the presentation. Okay. What we're going to do is break down each of the 4 stages, and I'm going to talk about the purpose. I will give you what it is and what it is not, and that will be followed by some power strategies, which I will talk about in just a moment. So as we look at the focus lesson, I just want to refer to our Shaping English Ning and the pre-webinar discussion where when I asked about modeling, Jae Young said, modeling should be fast and easy. I quite agree. Rita mentioned that it should not be monotonous. And then Feruza mentioned objectives. And so let's start with objectives. So with the objectives should be very clear. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but we really want our students to know what it is that they're going to be learning that day. And then we also model the task and we model our thinking. So what it is direct explanation, it's demonstration, quick modeling, fast and easy, as was mentioned, think alouds, and it's short. And what it is not is time to question students. So that awareness about separating your focused lesson from the part or the time when you ask questions. Students are not ready to be answering questions when the content is brand new to them. So some people in the discussion talked about modeling as who we are as teachers, and I will come back to that in the end of today's webinar. We are going to talk about that later. So what are some power strategies? Some of you, actually almost everyone in the lobby questions before the webinar said that their lessons last like less than 10 minutes. And so I say, great. Because we all know that our students can't really listen to much more than that especially if it's not their first language. So we as language teachers have learned to go with the mini lesson. So that's a power strategy, a very focused, quick mini lesson. I like the idea of posting short algorithms. So an algorithm is a fancy word for a math sentence, right? So I write, for example, when I talk about noun clauses, I will write Q plus S plus V, meaning that a noun clause is a question word plus a subject plus a verb. Sometimes the question word and the subject are the same, and then the verb. And so I will keep that up somewhere in my classroom, or I will write that on the board so that they have very succinct and quick information that is the very most important part of the lesson. So short algorithms are really important. I also like write alouds and graphic organizers. So let me show you, and I know this slide is a little bit difficult to see. It gives you just the kind of the idea. So the researchers of the gradual release of responsibility really support the idea of think alouds, because you want to be modeling your thought process as you are teaching. But we work with English learners, and we know that they can't listen to too much talk. And so a write aloud with the graphic organizer is a great way to do a think aloud with support. So if you have a graphic organizer and you fill it in as you're talking, as you're modeling, so you're talking, you're organizing, and you're writing your information, your students will have the best chance of learning. The picture on the right is my sloppy lesson teaching my students about making inferences. It's a matrix that I use during the whole lesson, including the guided lesson. So it's a little bit messy, but it's organized. And so I think that is the key in understanding right there. So as we go on to the next stage, guided instruction, the we do it together, this is the time to practice, to question, to notice student errors and misunderstandings. So what it is the strategic use of questions, prompts, and cues. So this is the trickiest time, and there's that answer to that question. It's the trickiest time because what it is not is a reteaching. We don't want to start the lesson over and give the same information. We want to think about how can we help our students get to the information, to the skill, to the content without reteaching. So we have to think, what does the error tell us? Okay, I just want to mention, and I'll bring this up later, that guided instruction is not every day and every student. So I don't want you to be thinking, oh my gosh, this is too hard. No, it's not every day, every student that you connect with, but it is often. So what Anderson, Reeder, and Simon say is that if you deny students the ability to practice with you, and you deny them the very thing they need to be competent. So your students need you with them while they practice. They need you to guide them, right? And to be noticing. So why is it tricky is because as they're making errors, you are analyzing those errors and you're questioning them. And some questioning is kind of flat. So even just telling the student the correct answer, kind of flat. But some questions ask your students to reflect and to use the strategies. So for example, if my student says, I enjoy to go dancing, I'm not going to go up and say, you enjoy going dancing. But I might say something like, could you say that again? That didn't sound quite right to me. And do you know why? And how can you be sure? Or how do you know? And that will cause them to, one, think about what it is, and then two, use the strategy, because I'm going to make sure that they use the strategy. In fact, I'll even say, check your chart. I'll be back in 1 minute to see what you find. Right? So I'm going to make sure that they are using the strategy that I want them to use. Okay, so this is really where you have to be thinking, what does the error tell you? Now, some power strategies that I like, the talk with your feet and then the jump to the right and jump to the left. The two bottom ones are kind of the same. One is for younger learners and one is for older learners. So if I have elementary school students, maybe I will line them up in front of me and I will say, I enjoy going dancing. Is that right or wrong? And they're going to jump to the right if it's correct, jump to the left if it's not, and then all of a sudden I have some assessment as to whether they got it or not. Talk with your feet is the same, just older students will walk to one side of the room if it's correct, walk to the other side if it's not. Now, I'm a big fan of sorting and labeling, and that is for students from 5 years old to as old as our students can be, because sorting and labeling is a great critical thinking skill, and it's one that is so easy to use with our students. So imagine this scenario where a teacher is teaching young children and they're doing transportation vocabulary. So this teacher has taught her lesson and introduced the vocabulary. So now for guided instruction, she's going to give each student a flashcard. And instead of just saying it, they're going to sort these flashcards into 3 categories: air, land, and sea. So the teacher asks, the student's going to come up with their flashcard, and the teacher asks, what is the name of this vehicle? And she's going to use the sentence frame, is to travel by . And so here's how it would go. She would say, so-and-so, please come up with yours. And she'll ask the class, what is the name of this vehicle? A boat. A boat is to travel by sea. And the students will say, a boat is to travel by sea. And so then the student will put that in the right place. Is it air, land, or sea? So they're thinking a little bit more. And here's an example of how that transportation vocabulary might sort, plus the language, the sentence frame to support that language learning. Okay? So let's go to the next stage, the collaborative learning, the you do it together. This is the stage where the teacher steps out, right? This is where the students are going to work together in peers, pairs, or groups. And the purpose is to build language and to practice language. And so think about that, always providing language support. So what it is not is a pass. That means that some students like to check out, to not participate in this stage, but that's not okay with us. So accountability in this stage is a must. It's important. Now, some power strategies might be the exit slip. So Katie talked about the exit slips in the webinar that I mentioned. So just having the students do it, I call it a ticket out the door, where they draw a picture or they write a sentence or something that shows that they're using the strategy or the content that we just gave them. And then sentence frames, as in the one I just showed you about the boat. And then also graphic organizers with language support. Now I want to show you how the language support in a graphic organizer can lead to some great language. So I know that this is a little bit hard to see, but this is some student work, and what a student was doing, they were a 4th grader about 10 years old, and they were talking about what happened in a reading about health. And so I used a graphic organizer to support them, but I would like to call your attention to the lines in the middle between the boxes. One says consequently, one says for that reason, and one says as a result. So there's some good language support that's going to help your students express the content that they just had. So they might say a sentence like this: they shared a brush. For that reason, they spread microorganisms. Now listen to that academic language. That is really great language for an ESL student at 10 years old. And that happened with that language support and graphic organizer. This is another one that's hard to see, but I wanted to show you the accountability in my gerund versus infinitive lesson. So when the students were, after the students had given each other the questionnaire, and this is one that my student did, they had to write sentences that reported their findings. And this was the individual accountability. So for example, this student wrote, 6 people mentioned that they enjoyed taking risks. So once again, fabulous language, fabulous academic language that they can use if you give them the support. Okay, let's do a quick check. The two middle stages, the guided instruction and the collaborative learning, can be kind of hard to determine. So I'm going to ask you this question, and thanks, Katie, for coming to this poll. So in a group of 4, students brainstorm useful verbs to use when talking about taking risks. The teacher lists the verbs and uses them in his lesson. He asks the students to explain their thinking. So which part would this be? So you want to be thinking that in the focus lesson, it's your teacher's 100% responsibility. The students are active listeners. But this is going to be more along the lines of either guided instruction or collaborative learning. The difference between guided instruction would be that the teacher's still involved. In collaborative learning, the teacher has stepped out. So what do you think this would be? So this is actually guided instruction because the teacher is still involved, right? The teacher is working with the students very closely. So let's go to the next one. The next quick check is which stage is represented in this activity. So in pairs, on the topic of risk-taking, students count how many times they can correctly use a gerund or an infinitive in 2 minutes. So let's see. So we know the students are working. Do we see the teacher involved? You guys are getting really good at identifying this. You can see by that number. This is absolutely collaborative learning. And you would see that because the teacher's not there. The teacher's hovering, right? I love that term, hover. They're just like around the edges waiting for them, waiting to guide or to correct, but really the teacher's not involved. And so wonderful, that would definitely be the stage of collaborative learning. And the difference is the involvement of the teacher. Perfect for going back to the presentation. So let me move on to there. Let's do independent practice. Independence and accountability is the purpose. You want your student actually doing the task that you taught in their assessment. You want it to be active. What it is not is endless worksheets or early homework. I'm going to talk about early homework a little bit later, but endless worksheets. Worksheets have their place, but we don't want to give too many. So all of these have their place. Some power strategies might be oral assessment and graphic and visual representation. So I just want to call your attention that oral assessment is one-on-one interviews with students. I know this is difficult in large classes, but just a reminder that not all assessment has to be written. And then also to call your attention that you could have graphic and visual assessment. So for example, you can see this graphic representation here where you might ask your students to write the names of 2 characters and then 2 adjectives that describe those characters. So that graphic organizer you can use as an assessment. And then as a visual representation, I know that this is also hard to see. This is work that my students have done. I think you can get the general idea. This was about genetics and what happens over generations. You can see on the visual representation on the right that student got the idea of stages and generations. You can kind of get that idea from her arrows and the information there. And then the student on the left, it's a very sweet picture, made me laugh. Visual representations will always make you feel great, give you a smile. But this, as simple as it is, it shows perfect understanding of a very complex writing and complex talk. talking. So excellent. So now let's just go over, what do you think? So which stage can be the trickiest stage? That's guided instruction, because you're thinking as you're like analyzing those errors and you're trying to figure out what is it they need and are they using their strategies. And it's actually really tricky, but also really fun. It's when you really are doing your very best teaching. So it's really a very fun stage as a teacher. And then which is the stage in which questioning strategies are extremely important? That would be guided instruction. So that's where you really are asking questions that are cueing, prompting, and helping your students to the answer without reteaching and without giving answers. So great. So I just want to note that you don't have to be there with all language learning. There's so much going on online right now. So a student notices gerund versus infinitive differences while trash talking on a video game with a native English speaker. So trash talking is how you talk to each other while playing a game. So I have had a lot of teachers tell me that their students are learning English through trash talking. So that is one thing that's happening, and that is A-OK. That is independent learning. And then also online, looking at students completing online exercises and then participating in a conversation via audio chat on a website like Live Mocha. And that also absolutely okay, independent and collaborative learning. All right, so I want to explain how you can do the most basic gradual release of responsibility in 5 minutes or less, and actually maybe 2 minutes or less. So here is a worksheet that, as you can see, it's a textbook page, and this is how I would support my students in doing this textbook page. So I'm going to be thinking about my 4 stages, and so for number 1, which says air travelers have to anticipate in long lines. I'm going to talk through that again, and I'm going to model. So I will say, all right, students, number 1, air travelers have to anticipate. Here's my chart. Here's my book. Let's look up. Look, I'm looking up. Wait. Oh, anticipate takes the gerund. So I'm going to say air travelers have to anticipate waiting in long lines. So I will have modeled the strategy. Then number 2, I'm going to do with my students. This would be our guided instruction. All right, you guys, do this with me. The electronics store agreed. Is it going to be to take or taking? Let's look up that word agreed together, and then we would determine the answer by doing that together. For number 3, collaborative learning, I might say something like, with your partner and your chart, look at number 3. Doctor, would you mind? And then they would look up, is mind, gerund, or infinitive. I'm going to make sure they're using it. They're going to tell me their answer. And then after that, they are free to go on. So we have taken just even a worksheet and applied the gradual release of responsibility. So let's use the chat box and see what you have to say. So how could you apply the gradual release of responsibility to this common teaching scenario? So if pretend that this teacher, and this would be an elementary school teacher, and they're teaching winter clothing vocabulary. So they're going to sing songs like sing a song, Put On Your Shoes, which is going to practice some of the vocabulary and review some of the vocabulary from before. Then the teacher's going to read the story, Froggy Gets Dressed. Together, the teacher and the students are going to create a graphic organizer which shows the story's sequence. And then the students will fill out a worksheet writing the winter clothing vocabulary. So once again, take a moment to think. And in the chat box, see if you have any ideas for how you could do to address every step of the gradual release of responsibility. What strategies could you use to improve this lesson? So I'll give you a moment to think, and some of us are having audio problems, and that will also give us a moment to talk about some of the audio problems. Okay, so I see somebody mentioned that songs are very important, and they are. Those songs are super important, especially with our young students, but I would say actually for all of our learners. Okay, so what ideas do you have to improve this lesson? So someone from Mexico is saying that they could add adjectives. That would be great. And yes, teenagers do love songs. I would agree. As soon as I said that, I thought, oh, I just left out the teenagers, which is just, they love songs for the most part. So Myrna said you could use TPR, total physical response, have your students act out. Froggy Gets Dressed is a great book for using TPR because it's about little Froggy who puts his clothes on, then takes them off, and then forgets things. So Katya says that you could design a poster. Great idea. Micheline says you could use concept maps. That's wonderful. It's a wonderful idea. You could have your students, as Adriana says, predict some of the ideas. Yeah, that's a great idea as well. Let's just take another moment, see if there's any last great ideas. Yvonne says that you could integrate it with a concept unit. So a concept unit meaning like maybe talking about the seasons, and winter is one part of that. So that's a great idea as well. I see somebody talking about acting it out. Wonderful. Matching pictures with the song content. Jose Manuel from Bolivia says students collaborate in order to put the lyrics of the song in order. All super ideas, super ideas. Role plays. So as you're doing these great ideas, just be thinking, is this, where is my role? What is my responsibility as a teacher? And what is their responsibility? And am I taking it slowly from me being fully responsible to my students being fully responsible as well? So thank you for your great ideas. Let's go ahead and go on to this section about teacher training. Now, I just showed you that with a worksheet, you can do the gradual release of responsibility in like 2 minutes or less. But I also want to talk about how you can apply it to a unit or to a longer amount of time. And I want to do that by talking about my experiences as a teacher trainer. Now, I was an English language fellow in Brazil working with high school English teachers who were a wonderful group of people. And I noticed that there are a lot of Brazilians on this webinar as well. So tell me if this isn't true. Many of my teachers seemed to be a little bit shy about their English abilities, and they were a little bit hesitant to try student-centered communicative language activities in their class. And I believe that they had every right to be nervous because many had not had much training yet in communicative language teaching strategies. In fact, many of them were literature majors and had had not much training on being a teacher at all. Their class sizes were big. Many of their students did not value English or see the importance of learning it. They themselves had not learned English in this way. So they, if anybody, deserved the gradual release of responsibility. So just take a moment, and I would love to know if you are a teacher who uses communicative language teaching strategies in your class. So raise your hand if that is one of the ways that you teach, by having student-centered instruction where your students are working with the language in communicative activities. So raise your hand if you've used communicative language teaching in your class. So wonderful, I see that. Oh, we all love CLT, wonderful. So yes, excellent. I'm noticing that from all over the world that we are using these strategies. That's wonderful. Okay, so the reason that I was sent to Brazil was to support teachers using these strategies. And more than that, I really believe that communicative language teaching is a great way to engage students and a wonderful way to empower students. And teachers, like everyone, are empowered by success. So it was important to use the gradual release of responsibility in this venue. My objective was that teachers begin to implement communicative language teaching practices in their classroom. I had a strategy as well. I wanted my students to use the lesson reflection guide, and that needed modeling as well. So let's break that down. So I started with the I do it phase, and this phase lasted a long time. So I modeled many lessons with teachers, and I modeled lessons in their classrooms. I went to their classrooms and modeled for the teachers. I modeled the lesson reflection guide as well. So here's a picture of my students practicing in class some communicative language teaching strategies while in class together. And I was leading this as a model lesson. Now I wanted my teachers to have the ability to reflect on those lessons and to do so well. So after the first lesson that I modeled, the first reflections were, oh, Sandra, it's a good lesson, or Sandra, it's a fun lesson, which was wonderful, but I wanted to get more depth, and I wanted to give my teachers the permission to critique me. Okay, so I created this lesson reflection guide where I'm going to break this down a little bit. I had the teachers learn about the objective of the lesson and give a brief description of the lesson, and then decide if the objective was clear, and then also use this scale of 1 being not evident, 2 somewhat evident, and 3 clearly evident. That so as they looked at the 5 questions, which I'm going to show you. So once again, I modeled this. We did this lesson reflection guide following the gradual release of responsibility. So I wanted number 1, 2, and 3 for the students, my teachers, to recognize if their language was at an appropriate level, and I wanted them to give evidence. So I wanted them to be able to say why they thought that. They could say 1, 2, or 3, but they had to say why. I wanted my learners to talk quite a bit. I wanted them to recognize if the learners were talking quite a bit. Did the students talk in the class, or did the teacher talk in the class, and give some evidence or explanation about that? And I wanted them to recognize if the participation was even. Did all students have the equal opportunity to speak, or were you just calling on 1 or 2 students? Number 4, the motivation is high. Was the lesson interesting and challenging? And number 5, were the students aware of their own learning? What feedback did you give to your students so they knew that they were on task? So it took a while to really get the teachers to do some deep reflection. I also wanted them to notice if it was a lesson that was hard to prepare for, if it related to their textbooks, because all needed to be teaching from their textbooks, and if the students were held accountable. So we took this idea through the gradual release of responsibility. The next step was that we do it together. So in our training sessions, the teachers worked in pairs and small groups with my support. They reflected also in pairs and small groups with my support about lessons using the lesson reflection guide, as you see here. We also did the you do it together, teaching each other in small groups. So here's a picture of the teachers teaching each other with themselves before they go to the classroom. And then finally, the you do it alone, where the teachers with their own classrooms. Here's a picture of one of my students, my teacher students, who did this lesson and used the lesson reflection guide. And I could not have been prouder or happier at her progress. Okay, so very quickly, let's do 2 more polls before we go into the last parts of this webinar. Which is the stage that you think can be skipped? So if you don't have time, which is the stage that you don't have to do, right? So think about that. the stage that can be skipped. You might want to move that slide to the next slide. And then it looks like, there you go, thank you. It looks like collaborative learning is popular. About half of you think that you could skip the collaborative learning stage. And then the others are all kind of around the same, but about 22% of you think that none of the stages can be skipped, that you really need to do all of them. Very interesting. So let's go to the last poll, what is the best sequence for effective instruction? And take a guess on this one too. What do you think is the best sequence? Once again, we're going to answer these questions as we go through the next part of it. About 59%, about 60% that think that the focus, lesson guided instruction, collaborative learning, and independent practice are the way to go. All right, so keep that in mind as we move on. So let's go back to the presentation. Excuse me. Okay, so let's look. So let's do some refinements. Let's talk a little bit about refinements. As I go into watching teachers that are learning to teach or are getting new instruction, we notice, research kind of supports this, that there tends to be a gap between what we know to trying things out, so training and instruction. So we know that sometimes students are asked to show something that they have not practiced. So we go straight from instruction to independent practice without having practice. Sometimes in class, our students get limited feedback or limited error correction. So I know that some of this has to do with time and some of this has to do with class size. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. We know that teacher lessons are sometimes not followed by practice sessions. We know that sometimes summative evaluations are given before formative ones. That means that the exercises that our students do that are graded are given before the practice ones. And then we know that homework is sometimes given because the teacher runs out of time to teach the lesson. I know that I'm guilty of this every once in a while. Oh, I ran out of time, so here, do this at home, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. So that's probably not the best practice as we go on. So let's do a poll. So I'm going to ask you, what obstacles do you think could get in the way of implementing the gradual release of responsibility in your classroom? So I saw in the chat room that there's some people are saying, yeah, but what about this? And yeah, but what about that? Well, let's talk about that. What obstacles could get in your way? And so we can see not enough time. Always a problem. So I think if I were answering, I would probably say the same thing, not enough time. Many of you have large class sizes, very large class sizes, and you have too many students to really get to every time. I'll talk about that in just a minute. That emphasis on testing, the lack of resources, students at very different levels. Some of you have students who are put into classrooms because of their age or their year in school, and it's not about their levels. That is also very difficult. So yes, thank you for giving me this input. Those are all very real concerns, and let's see if we can talk about some of them. Let's return back to the presentation and talk about some more refinements. Okay, so one thing is that, I'm going to go right here, is that the gradual release of responsibility, you don't necessarily need to do that in every lesson. Now, if you're a researcher on this, you're probably saying, no way, every lesson, it needs to be every lesson. But as a practitioner, as a practicing teacher, I can tell you that's a little unrealistic. So I always think, what are my most important lessons? And that's where I'm going to put my idea about the gradual release of responsibility. If it's a practice lesson, if it's a review, maybe I won't do it quite so religiously. And also, it's not a linear process. So you can start with any version, you can go in any order. So any order can work. That's the answer to one of your questions. And you will see as you play around with your instruction that it can be anywhere. The main thing is that, like I said, it's an awareness of who has the responsibility at any given time. And so when you use it and you're thinking about your lessons, often one of the middle steps is missing. So this is a refinement as well. As you look back on your lessons and you think, wow, that did not go as well as I thought, or worse, there's that blank stare. Here's what you can do. Think back. Did I do guided instruction, and did I also do collaborative learning? And more often than not, one of the middle steps is missing. And then I would also say that one thing where it tends to fall down is that there may be no individual accountability during the collaborative learning stage. So when you have group work, it's great to have each person in the group have something that they are responsible for. That way the students don't check out, and then you do really hold a high standard. So these were a little bit tricky questions. Which is the stage that can be skipped? My belief is none. Although given time, you don't have to do it every lesson. But if you really want to drive home, or you really have an important point, you want to do every stage. And what is the best sequence for effective instruction? Also a little bit of a tricky question. It's any sequence. So any sequence. It's more of an awareness that you're thinking, who's responsible for learning at any given point? And that's kind of the awareness. So now, if you get the blank stare, or even worse, you get the double blank stare. They're staring at you. I don't know what to do. And you're staring at them. But I just taught you a great lesson. Now you have a tool for reflection. You can go back and you can look at your instruction. So most people in the lobby questions said that they took time to reflect, and that's wonderful, about 85% of you. So now you also have a way to reflect. So let's finish up this webinar with outcomes. So student outcomes. Students receive instruction that, and don't we want this for all of our students, that results in deep learning, critical or creative thinking, or the ability to mobilize strategies. We want our students to be able to use strategies for their learning. That's the metacognitive awareness, when they can say, oh, I need this, and I'm going to use this strategy to do it. Okay, so that's what our student outcomes can be. But I'd like to spend a moment talking about teacher outcomes, which can be very Zen-like. So Zen-like is kind of a popular current term in English, and it refers to things like, well, there are things that maybe are easy to explain, but can take a long time to really understand. So sometimes I use the example of yoga. It's easy to get to somebody to say, oh, here, do this pose. But it might take a long time to really, really understand what that means, right? To really deepen your understanding about it. So the gradual release of responsibility is something that's like that to me. So because it was easy to explain, but it has taken me a long time to really understand its power. So what it does for you is it gives you a framework for reflection. You don't know what went wrong in a lesson? Go back and say, did I do all 4 of these steps? Right? It gives you a framework for looking back. It's also formative assessment in the truest sense. So for example, if you are doing both those interactive middle stages, you are getting on the ground, real time, right now feedback from your students about what errors they're making, what they consider to be important, who they are, and what levels they're at. So you are right there with them, and your instruction is going to be going straight to what they need. So those 2 middle steps are very, very informative. They give you formative assessment that you can use to guide your instruction. With the gradual release of responsibility, you set the floor but not the ceiling. That means that you set a foundation, right? You tell your students, this is what I want you to know. But unlike going straight to a worksheet, which limits what the students can show you, if you do those activities again, you open up your ideas you open up the ability for your students to show you as much as they know. Okay, so I'm just going to give a reminder that we are going to have a little bit of time at the end for questions. So some of you were asking that. So let me just go over the rest of these, and then I will open this up to questions. Okay, so I want to also say that you remain a learner. So if you are doing all these stages, you are listening to your students and they are teaching you. They're teaching you what they need. They're teaching you who they are, what's important to them, and what is the nature of your the errors that they're making. So you remain engaged and interested. It's very interesting. You also hone your craft. Another expression in English that means that you get better. If you have to plan for all those stages, you are going to be getting better and better at teaching. If you are noticing your students' errors and knowing where to go next, you are practicing your talent and your skill as a teacher. In other words, you are honing your craft. And then most importantly, and I think this is the key, you become student-centered in the truest sense because you show trust and confidence to your students. So in the pre-webinar discussion, Sakongo mentioned that we not only are modeling what we want our students to learn, but we are modeling how. We are showing them how we behave, how we dress, how we talk to them. Many people said that teachers are not just teachers, but leaders and psychologists. Some people mentioned the hidden curriculum, the values, the perspectives that we are talking about when we are teaching grammar. Isn't that interesting? We're really showing our students how we feel. So when you give your students the respect to go through 4 stages, and then you trust them and you're confident in them that they are going to show you what they need and that they are going to bring to you what they need and bring to you their interests, and you're going to listen to them. You could not be more respectful of who they are. So you are showing trust and confidence in them as students. I believe that our students allow us to teach them once we have gained their respect. So this quote is essential, and I will read it. I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized. So this is a lovely quote that tells you that the more respectful we can be by giving our students, by holding high standards, but giving our students what they need to reach independence in their learning, you could not be more inspirational, and you could not make their student life more joyous. So let's take a moment before I say a final thank you to see if you have any questions. So I got a question from Elizabeth from Peru who said, what if a stage does not work in the way we are expecting? Can we go back to the previous stage? Oh my goodness, absolutely, because that is exactly what we want to do. You came to something, it didn't work, and now you're going to reflect and think, oh my goodness, why not? Use that gradual release of responsibility, go back and reteach, do something different, add the stage that might be missing. Maybe you didn't do some collaborative learning and now it's time for that. So you can absolutely go back and go to other stages. Yeah, definitely. So let's see. I'm going to wait for you to ask some questions while I read my objectives. Hopefully, I introduced the gradual release of responsibility and demonstrated how it's this simple Zen-like awareness that can strengthen your teaching abilities. It can lead to authentic, student-centered classrooms, and it can provide a tool for self-reflection. So So interesting question from Pilar from Peru. What if students have different expectations considering their role? Oh, that always happens, especially when you throw something new at them. They think, wait a minute, I don't have to be expected to do this right now. So what I would say is you would definitely acknowledge that they might be having these feelings, but yet hold the course. That means keep going. You're going to say, yes, it is different. And yes, I do expect this from you now, but I will give them the support that they need to be successful. So everyone needs to feel success. So your students might feel success if you support them. And so a question from El Salvador. What happens if we skip one of the steps? Well, you just go back to regular teaching. You might end up not getting the results that you want, or you might, in the worst case scenario, get the blank stare. No worries. Go back and reflect and think, oh, yes, I forgot that collaborative learning. Maybe I'll do that tomorrow. So it's all good. Just use that reflection tool.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for sharing your knowledge with us of the gradual release of responsibility today. I think that we all have a different frame of reference and awareness for helping to bring our students to a new level of independence in their language learning. And of course, we here on the American English team would like to give our thanks to you, the audience participants, for your thoughtful consideration of these wonderful ideas today. And of course, you can always check out even more resources, including Sandra's forum article on americanenglish.state.gov. Please join us for our next webinar on June 3rd, Rock and Roll English Teaching. We look forward to learning with you during future webinars. Thanks again.